Hello, friends. I see many people are interested in today's session. That's a good thing. I still see more people trying to get into the meeting. Today is one of my favorite weeks of Kumi. It's speaking about Christian Zionism and how are we dealing as Palestinian Christians or as a movement of liberation theology to address the issues and the challenges that Christian Zionism raises for us. Today there has been a very interesting article at Haaretz speaking about a specific evangelical group that is creating some problems within the Palestinian village community. We will address this maybe later on with the questions and answers section. But if you are already subscribed to Haaretz, you'd have access to this article. Today we're blessed. We have our good friend, Don Wagner, with us. It's a pleasure having you with us, Don. May you try to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, how's that?
That's perfect, Don. We don't see you. So
that's good.
I mean, don't be shy, don't be shy. You're already too famous to be to hide your picture. So Don, it has been a tradition, as you know, at Kumi, we ask our speakers to introduce themselves. And we would like you to introduce yourself in the way that you would like, the best way of your choice.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank Sabeel and the Kumi Network for this opportunity. This is great work you're doing, and I just commend you for it, your faithfulness. I grew up as a Christian Zionist, you know, the end time fundamentalist type. And I went through two forms of Christian Zionism. The second one I caught in seminary, the mainline liberal Protestant version. And I'll talk about these. I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister, served 3 churches. And then I was bitten by the bug of Palestine, and ever since 1979 or so, I've been in some kind of advocacy work. For a time, I was a professor, and ended my career as the national program director of Friends of Sabeel. So I'm very close and cherish the work of Sabeel. I'm married to a wonderful Palestinian, and Linda Khatib, and now retired. So I'm trying to hone my writing skills in a different kind of advocacy. So I think that's about it. My writing skills in a different kind of advocacy.
Thank you, Don. I just want to remind, before we start, I want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and it is also being broadcasted live on Facebook. So if you don't want to appear online, which most likely you won't, but if you you don't want to even risk it, please just turn off your camera feed. We would start with the lecture. I know that you have started, Don, you have prepared a PowerPoint presentation for us.
Right.
And I will start from here.
Okay, well, there you see the not so subtle title, Christian Zionism, a pseudo-religion of apartheid, settler colonialism, and empire. And I love this quote from Pastor Mitri Raheb: "The land of Palestine is colonized by the military and by the Bible." So I'd like to delve into this and talk about Christian Zionism in, you know, a very critical way. It's been part of my life, my history for 40 years. And some of what I'm going to share is still in the process of being developed. It's interpretive, but it's where I am right now. And I've got a memoir that actually is officially coming out this week, and this is developed in the memoir. So if I disappear because of my internet or whatever reason, you'll have to get the book and see that in chapter 20. So next slide, please. To get us started, I think it's really important to set the historical context of where Christian Zionism comes into history and its relationship to political Zionism and Theodor Herzl. So when I taught a course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the first class session, I gave the class a little exercise. Where, when, and why did the Israeli-Palestinian struggle begin? And you might just think about that. I was going to have time, but I got too much material. So I'm going to have to give you the answers, but you might think about where you start the conflict and why. So my survey of history and whatnot and Christian Zionism indicates that the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, and I use the word struggle rather than conflict because conflict often implies two equal parties, and this is not what we have here. Some started in '67. There are textbooks that say that, but then they overlooked the Nakba and the founding of Israel in 1948. But if you start the conflict in '48, you miss the Balfour Declaration and the global imperial dimension. For me, I go back to the late 1890s, 1880s. The conflict starts in Europe, not in Palestine. And it starts because of European and largely Christian anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. So the Jewish community was reacting to the suffering and the horrible conflict they were facing. So I'll share a little bit of that. So where it starts in Europe, it's not a Palestinian problem. In fact, Palestinian Muslims, Christians, and Jews were getting along fairly well, attending each other's festivals and marriages. And we have record of that in the 1880s and 90s, even later. So I start the conflict when Zionism rises and some Christian Zionists begin to embrace Zionism. So that's the where and the when. Next slide, please. There were several movements in evangelical Protestantism that prepared the way for Christian Zionism to emerge as a political movement. And I make the distinction between the early precursors, we call them. And there was a movement called Restorationism. Reverend Brightman, who I show up on the screen there, writes in 1585 a book that basically calls that the Jews must be converted to Christianity and be encouraged to move to Palestine. Lord Shaftesbury was of this restorationist type of movement. He was a little bit more political, but each of these movements were really more doctrinal and evangelistic. Shaftesbury wanted to, and in fact, he lobbied the Parliament in England to set up a bishopric in Jerusalem, and they did. And actually, the first pastor was a Jewish convert, so that he could convert Jews and bring them to Christianity in the church. The idea of restorationists was that if the Jews will move to Palestine and convert to Christianity, it will bring on the second coming of Jesus. So there's always that millennial dimension. The other major millennial movement, which is dominant in Christian Zionism today, Stephen Sizer develops this beautifully in his writings, is Reverend John Nelson Darby. He's the fellow on the left, lower left. And Darby developed what was kind of some novel doctrines, such as the premillennial rapture. that Christians will be literally removed from history based on his literal interpretation of 1 Thessalonians 4. Then the Antichrist will rise, and eventually you will have a showdown with the modern state of Israel becoming a dominant military power, and the Antichrist militias and military will advance from the north, and there will be a battle in Armageddon, the Valley of Megiddo. Jesus comes back in this scenario as a militant Messiah, in total contradiction with the Gospels. But this is the movement that has become so popular and is growing actually globally in Africa, South Central America, Asia. So these early precursors were preparing the way for a political movement. So I called them precursors. In my early writings, I called them all Christian Zionists, but I think we have to make a distinction. Now, on the other hand, there are many Jewish precursors writing from the 1840s to deal with the issue of the attacks, the pogroms that were increasing. And one is the fellow pictured next to Darby. That's Dr. Leon Pinsker. Pinsker believed that Jews should assimilate. He was a wealthy and well-known doctor in Odessa in the Ukraine today. And then his house was attacked and burned. And he realized we'll never be safe. So he wrote a volume called Auto-Emancipation, where he identified the problem as Judeophobia, Western fear and hatred of the Jewish people, and that they will never be safe in Europe. Okay, next slide. So this is part 2. So now we move into the political dimension, both of Zionism and Christian Zionism. And this is a marked difference. This is where I believe Christian Zionism begins in my recent analysis. Zionism is a political movement of Jewish nationalism. And it's a particular type of nationalism. Zionism followed blood nationalism or romantic nationalism. And it is not based on democracy and equality, but it's the formation of the nation state according to ethnicity or religion. So, Germany for the Germans, or a Jewish state rather than one secular democracy. So this was what was advanced, and this came straight out of what was going on in Europe in the 19th century. And the goals of Zionism are to form a Jewish homeland, which really they always meant a state, but they covered that up with other language. But this Jewish homeland must have international political legitimacy and economic support from an imperial power. The Zionist movement was tiny, even into the 1930s. So they always viewed they had to have an empire to back it. And of course, they got it where? From Britain, with Balfour and the Balfour Declaration. Now, interestingly, and I got to cut this short, Christian Zionism begins to form when two particular evangelical leaders, one restorationist and one kind of a dispensationalist, begin to align themselves with a political agenda. The first was Reverend William Heckler, who was a chaplain to the British troops in Vienna. Heckler befriended Herzl, and their friendship grew. Initially, Herzl kind of questioned this guy. Herzl was totally secular. And here comes this end-time theology type chaplain with a long beard, acting very religious and talking about the end times, and said, aha, you are what I've been praying for, Herzl, and your Zionist idea. They befriended each other, and Herzl paid more attention to Heckler when he realized he had high connections with the German Kaiser's family and then with the Ottoman leadership. So Hitler began to take Herzl around for Herzl to market his plan and try to get either the German Kaiser or the Ottoman Empire to back his plan and give them land. They were both rejected. Now, I believe, but I don't have actual proof, that Hitler suggested then that the Zionists turn to the British, which they eventually did. The other political leader that I'll mention very briefly is William E. Blackstone, who's pictured here. He was from Chicago, where I'm from. And Blackstone wrote a book in the 1876, it was published, claiming Jesus is coming, and it was a distillation of the end time theology. It was a bestseller at the time. Blackstone realized he wasn't doing enough. So he made a trip to Palestine, and then he came back. And in 1891, he organized the first lobby. He had a petition drive financed by several of the wealthiest industrialists in the country. And that petition drive was published in newspapers from Maine to the Mississippi. They put it before then President Harrison, and it called for a Jewish state in Palestine due to the pogroms, and that the US will be blessed if it comes around the Jewish people. So there you have the first political lobby 7 years before the first Zionist Congress takes place. Okay, next slide. So again, to reiterate, Zionism is a political movement designed to create, I would say, a Jewish state with international political legitimacy. This is where the empire comes in. Ultimately designed to replace the Palestinians with Zionist sovereignty in all of historic Palestine. So early Christian Zionists embraced the Zionist program. And I want to mention now, I developed two types of Christian Zionism. First is the fundamentalist Christian type, which is a movement within the fundamentalist wing of Protestant evangelical Christianity. Evangelicals are a big umbrella, and it's got different tendencies. You have progressives who are with the Palestinians and want justice. They're anti-war, strong on the environment. But then you have the fundamentalist wing and the right, and this is where you get the John Hagees, the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, and so on. So that's where they're housed. And they believe the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and thus it inherits the entirety of the land of Palestine. So they provide a theology that justifies the Zionist vision for the replacement of the Palestinians. You often look at Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So if America, and Jerry Falwell would say, if America supports Israel, we will be blessed as a nation. The moment we get a little bit critical, God will punish us. So that's it in a nutshell. Now there's another model of Christian Zionism. I call it Christian Zionism hiding in plain sight, the Protestant and Roman Catholic type. And this emerges much later in the 1830s and 40s. And it basically is an answer to the Nazi Holocaust, that with a long history of anti-Semitism, which Christians often were responsible for, we need to repent and guarantee the Jewish people their own state. And this is why many liberal Christian Zionists support the state of Israel, right or wrong, unconditionally. Some will be a little bit critical of the settlements and so on, but basically it's the Jewish people have unconditional right to the entirety of Palestine. Next slide, please. Omar, you got the next one? There we go. Thank you. I want to make it clear that we've been quite easy often on Christian Zionism, thinking it is this bizarre movement, and we make jokes about it, but it's very serious. And from the earliest days of Herzl, they basically embraced the idea of transfer of the Palestinians. And Herzl writes, you're familiar with this, we shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it employment in our country. Both the process of expropriation and removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly, inch by inch, and circumspectly. So they often covered this because they didn't want their international donors and supporters politically to see how deep and serious this was. Then you have the quote, which is quite graphic, from Joseph Weitz, director of the Jewish National Authority. There is no other way but to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries, to transfer all of them. Not one village, not one tribe should be left. Now, I'm going to make the distinction here. There were many Zionist forms of Zionism, models of Zionism that were open and progressive, even some that wanted a one secular state where everyone would be equal. But those forms of Zionism have been eclipsed pretty much by revisionist Zionism and ultranational Zionism. So this is what I'm talking about. And these themes were there from the earliest days of Herzl. You can see the quotes. Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, wrote in 1936, "We must expel the Arabs and take their places." So full stop. Next slide, please. So back to the mainline Protestant form, and this is very much alive in all of our Protestant denominations and the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the strongest representatives was Reinhold Niebuhr, who was one of the preeminent theologians of his day. Niebuhr embraced the Zionist movement, full stop. And he organized a lobby that lobbied President Truman at the time to avoid any form of a secular one-state solution for the Palestinians, but to partition Palestine so that a Jewish state could be created. So he focused on that rather than the democracy for all. In fact, there's a period where Niebuhr was informed that the Nakba was going on. Palestinians were being massacred and driven out. And Reinhold Niebuhr's response was, well, this will be necessary in order that the Jews can have their state. So he had this blindness. He justified even a genocide so that the Jewish state could be there. Next slide. So I want to underscore the Holocaust must be studied and continually reaffirmed so it'll be never again, but never again for anyone, including Palestinians and any other people. So our struggle in the mainline churches is often to overcome this narrative of Zionism and liberal Christian Zionism. Mark Ellis talks about the ecumenical deal. And the idea there is that our progressive churches agree to have dialogues to build relationships with the Jewish people, which is very important, and with the rabbis. But the rabbis and the major Zionist movements will say, hey, we don't want you raising the issue of justice for Palestine or human rights or critiquing us. That's for us to do. Let's just have wonderful dinners, have good friendships, and the rest will take care of itself. So this is the ecumenical deal, or the fatal embrace that Mark Braverman discusses. So again, Christians are then told, when you support BDS, and we ran into this in the Presbyterian Church when we tried to adopt it, 10 years of a struggle. And we're always told BDS is anti-Semitic. It's delegitimizing Jews and undermining the future of Israel. But no, we have to stand for justice and use nonviolent tools to do that. So also in the Zionist narrative, and we see this play out with the mainline churches, that Israel is always the victim of a Palestinian and Muslim world, whereas the Palestinians then are the aggressors. So these are some of the concerns that we find in our mainline churches, and we have a long struggle ahead of us, but progress is being made, and I'll point to a few points. Okay, next slide. Okay, part 3, and I'm going to have to do this quickly. I found that an anthropological discipline that most of you are familiar with, called settler colonialism, is a really useful way for us to understand and interpret Christian Zionism and Zionism. And it's a relatively new discipline, and at the same time, it's been around longer than we think. And Patrick Wolfe was an Australian, and unfortunately, he died prematurely. But he pushed the idea that settler colonialism must be a distinct and separate intellectual discipline. And he focused a lot on Zionism. He wrote, "Settler colonialism destroys to replace." So mark that. And he used the term terra nullius, Latin that translates nobody's land. So the indigenous people of the United States, our American Indians, were nobody. And the US settlers came in and they took over and they marginalized and then ghettoized our indigenous people. Wolfe saw this happening with the Aboriginal in Australia. So settler colonialism is a replacement. Usual colonialism is that it's brutal. The empire comes in, takes over, exploits the resources, marginalizes and puts the people under strict military rule, but they don't replace them. Settlers in settler colonialism actually replace. They either eliminate or they place the indigenous in ghettos, reservations, or Bantustans. So some scholars even argue, and Wolfe was one, that settler colonialism will use violence to reach its goals of displacement, including genocide. And we saw that take place in the Nakba. So Christian Zionism, as it proclaims that the Jewish people have the right to the entirety of Palestine, provides a pseudo-religious justification for Zionism's endgame. And this is another reason why it is so dangerous. Next slide. So just a little bit more. The conquering power replaces the indigenous people to control and then dominate and replace. And in the case of Israel, all of the land, the resources, the economy, the airspace are all controlled by Israel. The goal is complete hegemony, political, economic, and military sovereignty over the indigenous. And of course, the maps you're all familiar with. So the fundamentalist model of Christian Zionism, and to some extent, the mainline Protestant model, turns the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into a religious argument, a war between God's chosen and those who are not chosen, the apostles or disciples of the Antichrist. And in the Darby, the pre-mill movement, Jesus returns as a military Messiah, a complete distortion of the gospel. So Palestinians are invisible, removed, transferred from their land. And Christian Zionism uses this false biblical narrative to justify Christian hegemony as a cover for what the Zionist movement is doing. Next slide. So settler colonialism is not so new. Fayez Sayek, who was a brilliant Palestinian Christian, by the way, published Zionist Colonialism in Palestine in 1965, using settler colonial analysis of the issues. Then the non-Zionist brilliant professor at the Sorbonne, Dr. Maxime Rodenson, totally independent from Sayek's work, said the same thing. Israel, a settler colonial state question, and he claims it is. So we have many scholars who are using this analysis. Alain Papé is one that we all must read. Jeff Helper, in his latest work, uses it. Rashid Khalidi in the 100 Years' War, and many, many others. So I find that settler colonial analysis complements Palestinian liberation theology and gives us a powerful tool. Next slide. We better skip this because I'm running out. And move on, please, Omar. So now a little bit on the theological challenge. I think the great Dr. Walter Brueggemann, who published a seminal work on the land, missed the whole idea of settler colonial ideology until recently, and now he really gets it. In a little book called Chosen, he says, "It will not do for Christian readers of the Bible to reduce the Bible to an ideological prop for the state of Israel, as though support of Israel were the final outcome of biblical testimony." So move away from the Zionist concept and use more critical tools primarily found in liberation theology. Next. So Naim Atik, Brueggemann, and many others point out, as most of us know, there are different narratives in the Bible, and they can be used to critique each one. There's an inclusive narrative where the land belongs to God, and it is for all, even the sojourner in your midst. But the other is a more exclusive narrative, where we find the land is only for one people, and that is the Jewish people. And this is where Christian Zionism picks it up, and we find this also in the mainline type of Zionism. So what we're searching for is texts that will critique, and they are many. In fact, in Leviticus, it says, if you violate the covenant by stealing, by creating idolatry, the land can be lost. And indeed, the land was lost. And equality must be one of the standards, that everyone is equal, imago Dei, created in the image of God. Psalm 87, the book of Jonah, and the Hebrew prophets lift this up, as do Jesus' teachings. Okay, next. Finally, now, I want to talk about advocacy, and I'm going to have to rush this. But in the desperate moments of June 21, when Netanyahu was waging war on the Palestinians and threatened to annex all of the West Bank, a group of Christians gathered in Bethlehem and issued the beyond urgent cry for hope, a call to the churches globally for resistance and solidarity. It says it's not enough just to sit by, but as you did with South Africans during the anti-apartheid struggle, we must have stronger resolutions. And we got a few. The United Church of Christ passed a powerful resolution in 21 on apartheid and much more. So our friends in Bethlehem were calling for complete solidarity with Palestinians, including nonviolent resistance and BDS. They called for legislative action in our parliaments and Congress around the world to put pressure on them to contain what Israel was doing. At the same time, they were wise to say we must have solidarity with Jewish communities, with the synagogues, in resisting anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And we must support interfaith initiatives that bring this forward. And finally, come and see what's happening on the ground. Next slide, please. I want to add a couple things to the list here. One is that we must find ways to confront groups like Christians United for Israel, the International Christian Embassy. And the Christian Embassy is going to have its Feast of the Tabernacles, I think in October. And it should not go by just as a normal event. I think Christians globally should be involved in challenging it and finding ways to get media coverage and to do it, of course, nonviolently, creatively. So that's number one. We must step up our advocacy on the Christian Zionist movements. And by the way, CUFI and Christian Zionism is growing in Central and South America. The South American churches are forming a conference to deal with this and get better tools. In Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Christian Zionism is booming in massive churches, huge mega churches. Asia, even India, inside China. So this is becoming another political force for Israel and the Zionist movement. So it needs to be confronted. A second thing I'd like to raise is we should consider in various countries, and here in the United States, it's going to be difficult, but challenge Christian Zionism tax-exempt status. They get a tax-exempt status to provide support for settlements. The Christians United for Israel gives Israel roughly $1 million to $2 million a year, all tax-exempt. This needs to be removed because it's violating U.S. tax codes. Same in Norway, England, and Germany, and around the world. So that's another step. Then we need to work on, and I think you are doing it, global solidarity. We need a global network that is bringing people together, and Kumi is the basis, is one of the models for this. The BDS movement is another. We need to bring together Black, Latinx, Muslim, people of all genders, Jewish Voice for Peace, youth together and build a global movement. So we'll be on the same page, more or less. This can be done. Okay, next, and we'll conclude. Status confessionis. This is a term that basically is saying there are certain Christian movements that are heretical, that they are out of status with the historical creeds and confession of the church. The Black South African movement was able to achieve this with the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, declaring apartheid is a sin against God and humanity. We need to do the same with Christian Zionism. And we have the basis for this in the Barmen Declaration that basically said German Nazi ideology is racist and out of order with the creeds of the churches. Belhar confession the same. So and this is going to have to come from the grassroots because the bishops and many of the pastors won't do this. Next two, and we'll be done. We can skip. Oh, let me just pull one thing up out of here. Christian Zionism, as it supports this idea of Israel being right or wrong in terms of its approach to apartheid in the state, is basically creating an idolatry of the state. So this is another basis of our critique. And we have plenty of scriptures such as Naboth's vineyard and others to help us with this. So another basis of critique of Christian Zionism is the idea of idolatry. The state, even the military, and the national identity of Zionism creates an idolatrous issue. Christian liberation theology pushes us in the opposite direction. It pushes us to the poor, calling for equality of all people. And this is where Jesus and the Beatitudes, the Magnificat, and the Hebrew prophets also take us. And then we must resist. Stand with the poor until justice is done. Next. Mark Braverman wrote a powerful piece where he states, we must acknowledge that Zionism and Christian Zionism were tragic mistakes, understandable but catastrophic wrong turns in the quest for safety and dignity. Until then, until there is justice, we will continue to build a state on top of a lie and a crime. The Palestinians will continue to resist by steadfastly refusing to relinquish their identity, their way of life, their connection to their homeland. Occupied, harassed, imprisoned, blockaded, bombarded, starved, betrayed by their political leaders, but proud, unbowed, and refusing to disappear. That's Kumi, that's resistance and rising up. Finally, I look to that great text of the unjust judge and the widow, where the widow keeps coming and knocking on the door of the unjust judge. And the scripture says that judge cared nothing for God or for values or Torah. And this is the path that Israel has chosen. And the widow keeps harassing and banging on the door. And finally, the judge says, give her justice. Basically, get rid of her. She's worn me down. This is our calling, our challenge. So there it is in scripture. Kumi, rise up like the widow, who had very little power, but she was able to overturn the injustice. So, amen. That's the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Don. Excellent, excellent. I want to ask you, do you still need the presentation or should I end sharing?
I think that's it. You can pull it out.
Okay, Don. I have a question. Scholars, some scholars say that Christian Zionism has its roots to the 16th or 17th century. You start on the 18th century.
Yeah.
Where did you start?
Yeah, I would actually agree with that. I didn't mention it, but I have it in the book, that really the Reformation begins to proliferate different teachings and interpretations of the Bible. So I think the roots are there, but what I'm trying to look at is how it focused more on Israel. And you have some of these millenarian movements cropping up right after the Reformation. So when the Bible begins to get into the hands of the people, which is a good thing, but it runs the danger of all kinds of bizarre interpretations. So, but I wanted to point to how the particular focus came upon Israel with these millenarian movements, the restorationists, and then the premillennial dispensationalists. And they prepared the way then for political Christian Zionism in the 1890s.
So there's a question. Do you think that the Balfour Declaration was intended to provide a place for the Jews? So Britain would have to accept a huge influx of Jewish refugees from Europe?
Yeah, I left that out. I make a lot more of the Balfour Declaration in the book. Lord Balfour himself was raised in this end time theology. And when he first met Chaim Weizmann, who took over from Herzl with the Zionist movement, Balfour thought he too was a prophet, just like Heckler said about Herzl. And so while Balfour's views and those around him were imperial, They wanted to basically create a land bridge and control Palestine all the way over to the Persian or the Arab Gulf and Kuwait, so they would have access to India. That was his vision, but he found the Zionist movement convenient and helpful. So he was predisposed to embracing Zionism because of his, basically his Christian Zionist views. But his goal was really imperial. And the Zionist movement was tiny. But it again shows how Balfour, David Lloyd George, and the others ignored the Palestinians. They saw them as nobody. They didn't have the power, they weren't familiar, and they didn't trust them. But they thought that they could trust the Jewish Zionists. And in fact, the Balfour Declaration was issued, and it gave the first political legitimacy to the Zionist movement. They were really nowhere globally, but the Balfour Declaration was written right into the treaties that settled World War I. So it gave a false legitimacy to the Zionists, and then colonization started.
Thank you, Don. There's a question, actually, you might help. So our friend from Latin America is saying, Maria is saying that that Christian Zionism, she agrees, is spreading very fast in Latin America. Her main reason is that there aren't enough Spanish material in Spanish to challenge Christian Zionism. Are you aware of specific material that is in Spanish?
Yeah, it's just beginning. I'd urge you all to take a look, if you haven't already, at the website www.christianzionism.org. It's in Spanish and in English. And this is a very good resource written by evangelicals to try to confront Christian Zionism. So that is one. But there's a meeting that's either going on or just finished in Chile of pastors from all over South and Central America who are putting together resources, and people are beginning to write. We need it also in Portuguese. You know, one of the largest mega churches, which is fanatically Christian Zionist and politically involved, is in Brazil. So Christian Zionism is booming in Brazil, Nigeria, and across the globe, as I mentioned, even China. So it's a global phenomenon, and it's political. Let me give one little reference. One of the recent presidents of Nigeria was a fellow named Goodluck Jonathan. He was an elder in the Christian Zionist congregation. When he was elected, he would bring twice a year groups to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli leadership, and they rolled out the red carpet. It paid off for them because, I forget the year, but Nigeria was on the UN General Council of Human Rights, and there was a strong anti-settlement, critical of Israel resolution coming down. Netanyahu called Goodluck Jonathan and said, "Hey, we need you to step up now and revoke this." He did, and it went nowhere. So this is kind of how it works. So many of these Christian Zionist leaders get in the government, or their power is significant, and they play a political role.
I just want to say that we have around 20 questions done. So I don't know if we can either, so if there's a version of the answer, do it. If there isn't, I mean, that's it. We're not going to be able to fulfill every question. So why do you think Christian Zionism is growing in Africa, Asia, Latin America, particularly when these countries themselves have suffered the consequences of imperialism?
Yeah, well, I think Christian Zionism presents a simple answer. It's very binary, good versus evil. I mean, look at the United States. um, how many copies did the end times, first the let's say I'm blanking on Left Behind series, 5 volumes, sold millions of copies. This was popular in the United States. Christian Zionism thrives when there's conflict, and it provides a simple answer, and it's very binary, the good versus evil. And don't you want to be on the side of the good? So if you accept some of the theology, you want to avoid the rapture. You want to be taken up into heaven, by Jesus, so you're not left for all the suffering. So it creates a simple solution, but it also creates kind of this injustice toward the Palestinians. And it really supports maximalist interpretations, including ultranationalism and authoritarianism. So when authoritarianism is thriving as it is now, this movement hitches its saddle to this authoritarianism and provides a simple binary good versus evil answer. And it's fear-based. Fear is one of the strongest motives to organize people politically. So that's another reason it's growing so much.
I have another question, Don. Recently, we started to hear the new term of Muslim Zionists or Zionist Muslims. They are divided into 2 groups. There's one group that they say that it is written in the Quran that God has given this land to the people of Israel, to the Jewish people. And then you have another group who are very much, in a way, they're trying to justify why the Arab world or the Muslim world has lost the battle of Palestine or lost Palestine in 1948. And they say God has written that the Jews have to gather for the final battle to happen, where and Jews will clash. Do you have an idea if these were Christian ideas, Zionist ideas that spilled over Islam, or what are their sources and connections?
Yeah, now I'm not an authority on this, but I'm familiar with it. And I do believe that this Christian Zionist end time theology did impact some of these folks. I remember being in Beirut about 15 years ago and hearing a lecture by a Muslim sheikh, a Shiite in Beirut, on these ideas, that the rise of the Antichrist will come. And then there will be, this end time struggle. It was totally right out of Hal Lindsey's work, The Late Great Planet Earth. So somehow this guy was reading that and applying it as a Muslim to the Quran. So it provides a hermeneutical lens that distorts Quran or the Bible, Torah, whatever. So yeah, it's there. I'm not an authority on it. Others will have to do the heavy lifting on that.
But one question, maybe you can help us out. If this came, because many of these are part of the Sunni or the Sirah Nabawiyya, so they have the roots from maybe from the 7th century, if the sources, or 8th century, 9th century, the latest. So they've been affected by some Jewish or Christian Zionist ideologies. So that would really contradict with some of the arguments. Somebody might come and say, look, is that have somehow present in Islam, so if they have been affected by Christianity, so they have the roots deeper. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, sure it is. Yeah. But again, I don't want to speak as an authority on this. People are working on it, and it's I think there are publications that are coming out or have already made the analysis from the Quran to correct this.
So we have another question. Has the impact, did the closure of the evangelical TV company in Israel have an impact on evangelicals?
I don't think so. We don't see any we don't see any diminishment of their effect because the growth is happening in the United States. Well, actually, the United States, there's a slight decline, polls are showing, as Trump has gotten himself finally possibly convicted. We still have Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo, who may run for president, who are flaming strong Christian Zionists. But there's a little bit decline in Christian Zionism, but it's not diminished. But where it's growing really is Central, South America, Africa, and Asia.
There have been many attempts to persecute and to get rid of Jews in Europe, unfortunately, in the past. Do you think that Balfour was a good example, that it was driven by anti-Semitism, not only by Christian Zionism?
Yeah, that definitely played a role because, anti-Semitism was a real thing. I mean, from the early centuries of Christianity, there's anti-Semitic threads that got out of control. And what was happening in Eastern Europe really had a lot of pressure. Now, one point that's interesting was that while Balfour supported Zionism and Christian Zionism, he opposed movements that were trying to settle Jews in England. He voted against increasing the immigration in, I think it was 1901. So he had this streak of anti-Semitism. He didn't want Jews living next door, but hey, let's settle them in Palestine so I don't have to deal with them here. So it's a real mixed bag. So I think Christian Zionism, of course, with Balfour and David Lloyd George, predisposed them to embrace the Zionist movement. But their goals were ultimately colonial power. That's what was really driving them.
Thank you, Don. Do you think that it is possible that we should always include combating anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together?
Well, yeah, I think that there are forms of racism. And if we're talking about kind of liberation theology, we are anti-racist. We are calling for everyone is created in the image of God. And of course, anti-Semitism gets more favorable treatment in the West. But thankfully, we have many Muslim advocacy groups that are raising our advocacy and our connections and our support to stop Islamophobia, which is very real, really powerful. And so anyway, yes, I would say. They don't have to dilute each other. They're complementary forces, along with our anti-racism.
But they also feed, one feeds the other, Islamophobia and Christian Zionism.
Yes, right.
What is the historic area of boundaries of Palestine as compared to today's political boundary?
Well, that's much debated depending on what period you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are maps from the Likud party that claim Palestine or the future Israel includes South Lebanon, all of Jordan, even over to Iraq, from the river to the sea, basically. But I think these are must be rejected. So in terms of international law, I think we must accept historic Palestine of the maps of 1947 and earlier. And yeah, so I would go from 1947, some will say 49 in the armistice.
Thank you, Don. Don, I think you're having some computer problems.
Am I back?
Yes, it's better.
Okay,
See you better.
we
Maybe.
made it an hour.
So Don, I want to ask you one more, or two more questions, and that will be it.
Okay.
Are there plans to publish your book, Glory to God in the Lowest, in Spanish?
Not yet. I'm talking with some friends in South America about a Spanish translation, but we're early. It's just coming out this week, and you know, my publisher says, "Oh, let's deal with that a little bit later." But I'd like to see that happen, maybe even Arabic.
Yeah, that would be great. In as many languages as we can.
Yeah.
There's a great need.
Yeah, if it's worth it, we'll see.
So it's the final question. Maybe we'll start with what we have mentioned. So today there was news released that there is an evangelical group combination. It's a US-based evangelical group with its connections and funding of a Norwegian TV station, evangelical station. They've been funding over the planting of 3,000 trees in Palestinian in the West Bank, in Palestinian-owned trees for a settler project, without even requiring permits. So this is an article in Haaretz. It was shared on the news. And many people are saying that this is a first-time escalation from a direct involvement of Christian Zionists taking over Palestinian lands. Do you think we're going to be seeing that there's more people who are becoming more extremists, or this is just a one-time incident? Hopefully?
Well, I would submit this isn't the first time. It's happened before. But I think this is a sign that we will be seeing more, because the the present government of Israel, constituted by this hardline revisionist Zionism and the ultra-nationalists, they need Christian Zionism to provide this justification around the world. In what better way than to give them perks? But this is where I think we need to step up and work on closing the tax loopholes to shut this down. We have to expose it, but then we have to be creatively advocates to end the injustice. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to critique this, get publicity, and thank God how Haaretz has issued this article. I haven't read it yet, but I'm keenly interested in what this is. But there's a history of this. And there's a long history of Christian Zionist support of settlements like Ariel, bringing people over to pick the olives or the grapes in the fall, entirely funding these efforts and getting tax exempt status for it. So this has been going on a long time, and it's about time we really rise up, resist it, expose it, and find ways to stop it. And that's not going to be an easy task.
Thank you, Don. We have, with Kumi, every Kumi week, we have a Kumi action. We've already sent it to the email, to the bigger list. But if for people, we would recommend that you buy a book by a Palestinian theologian or an international theologian, like our good friend Don, a book, and donate it to a library or to your university or to a school or to your church. A book that challenges Christian Zionism, so that it is available for people to use. A part of Glory to God in the Lowest, what other books would you recommend, Don?
Oh, Stephen Sizer has two excellent books on Christian Zionism. Gary Burge is a well-known author. He's got two good books on the land. He's a New Testament theologian. Was it Wheaton? Now is at Kelvin Seminary in Grand Rapids. Walter Brueggemann's little book, Chosen, is good for church study to get started. Colin Chapman, he had one of the first great books on exposing Christian Zionism, as a new version now. Robert Smith would be another. And then I'd recommend again www.christianzionism.org. And there's more literature coming out. Mitri Raheb, he publishes a book every year. Naima Teek's Justice and Only Justice, and then his marvelous book on Palestinian liberation theology. Somebody just reminded me of Munther Isaac, and some of the evangelicals are publishing books. Maybe we could work together to come up with a good bibliography, including articles that we can make available for people.
There's also a very big. There's also a very good. We this week for this week to speak about the topic of Christian Zionism because it's the anniversary of the Jerusalem Declaration on Christian Zionism.
Right.
So that might be a good, strong statement to also include with the position of the churches on Christian Zionism.
Yeah,
So
in fact, there's a bibliography in the website christianzionism.org. Maybe needs to be updated with some of these. Sorry, Omar.
No, I agree. You know what's really energetic is that there's so many different books, so many different options. 20 years ago, there were very few, if any. Now, things are changing. The sun is shining and its change is coming, Don.
Yeah, and we got to be among those who shine a light on this as the false theology it is.
Yes, and in October, hopefully you are in Jerusalem.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. And you're not joining the Feast of the Tabernacles, which is a big celebration for Christian Zionists, but we might do something together, yes?
Yes.
Yes, we might. It's almost certain. It's going to be fun. So thank you very much, everyone. Next week, we're meeting another Sabil Kumi, excellent speaker, Violette Khoury. She will be speaking about her inspirational topic of art as resistance, doing an amazing job in Nazareth now with a group of dedicated women. They're reviving and maintaining the Palestinian cultural identity in Nazareth. So don't miss next week. And thank you all for joining. Thank you, Don. We love you. We love you all. And God bless you, our friends.
Yeah, God's blessing on everyone, and let's rise up with Kumi.
We're already rising up.
Yeah, we are. We need more.
We need more. But we're already living the resurrection and the rising up. So we're already on the mode.
Thank you, Omar and friends.
Thank you, my friend. Take care.